Have you ever heard of a reward so twisted the man receiving it wished he'd never laid eyes on it? Not gold, not land, not silver coin, but 2 human lives, bound and broken, offered like property. If this is the first time you've heard of such a tale, hold tight to your seat, because what follows is unlike anything you've ever known. Before we ride deeper, don't forget to like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story will not only drag you back into the harsh frontier, it will press you to face questions about morality, choice, and the price of freedom. The Arizona sun was still blazing like an open furnace, and along the red dirt road leading into the town of Red Rock, a tall, gaunt figure appeared, shoulders bent under exhaustion. That was Ethan Callahan, a man who once wore a soldier's uniform, once carried a rifle for a war nobody even remembered right or wrong anymore. Now he was just a bounty hunter, dragging behind him the half-dead body of a horse thief the town had been chasing for weeks. Ethan's horse snorted ragged breaths, legs trembling as if ready to buckle. Ethan himself was little better 6 days of tracking, 2 days of dragging his catch, barely a wink of sleep. His thoughts spun like fever. All that remained in him was weariness, and a steady, gnawing doubt. Was he even doing the right thing? Was the justice he served real, or just another excuse for powerful men to buy and sell blood? When Red Rock finally came into view, there were no cheers, no raised glasses, no hero's welcome, just sagging rooftops, a saloon with a faded sign, and the town council waiting on the steps like vultures circling meat. Councilman Hardin, a round man with neatly trimmed whiskers and a smile that never reached his eyes, stepped forward. "You brought him back alive. Thought you'd be bones in the desert yourself." Hardin sneered. Ethan didn't bother replying. He pulled a key from his belt, dropped it into a hired man's hand, and rasped, "Alive." Like the deal said. Hardin smirked, but instead of reaching for silver, he gestured to 2 other men, who opened a back door. That was when the real reward appeared. 2 young women walked out, hair long and tangled, bare feet raw, wrists swollen from thick hemp rope. Twin sisters Apache by their look. Their faces were blank, eyes hollow, movement silent. No one's claimed them. Just spoils from a smuggler's caravan, Hardin said in a syrupy tone that cut cold. "You've given this town peace. We figured you deserved something more lasting than coin. Call it compensation for those lonely nights at your cabin." Ethan stood frozen. Sweat rolled down his spine, but not from the desert heat. Old wounds inside him split open again. He looked at the 2 girls, not trophies, not property, but human beings handed off like cattle. One nod from him and they would belong to him, tied to his name like shackles, a so-called gift. Exhaustion gripped his body. Suspicion tore at his thoughts. Did he even have the right to change their fate? Was setting them free, saving them, or just pushing them toward death in the unforgiving wild? The question buzzed like flies over a carcass. Slowly. Ethan's hand dropped to the hunting knife on his hip. The council tensed, a few reaching for their guns, but he didn't swing it at them. He stepped forward, deliberate, and cut the rope binding the sisters' wrists. The cords fell into the dust, heavy and useless. Ethan handed the knife back to Hardin, his voice flat and low. "My reward is done. The man's alive. That was the condition. We're finished." Without waiting for reaction, he turned, mounted his staggering horse, and rode off down the street. Behind him, silence clung to the air, the kind that comes when people don't yet know what to make of what they've seen. Only the twins remained, no longer bound, their eyes flickering with something fragile, not hope, not yet, but at least the absence of chains. Ethan didn't look back. He knew he'd just hurled a stone into the still pond of Red Rock, and the ripples would spread. But he also knew this in a world where justice was traded like beef at the market. The only way he could keep living with himself was by refusing to become part of it. There are footsteps that follow you even when you never invited them. At first, they sound like nothing more than the wind twisting through a canyon. But when you finally turn, you find they have faces, real eyes, and an untold story you're not ready to hear. That was how Ethan Callahan realized the two Apache sisters were still behind him, silent as twilight shadows even after the rope had been cut. That evening, the sun hung in the sky like an unhealed wound. Ethan returned to his ranch, body spent, mind heavy. He expected only one thing, the familiar silence of the hand-built cabin he had hammered together plank by plank. But when he led his horse into the barn, he saw them, standing at the fence line 20 yards away. Lena and Maris' dark eyes, blank faces neither stepping forward nor turning back. Ethan stood there for a long while. A strange hesitation pressed on his chest. He didn't want them here, but he couldn't bring himself to drive them off either. Life had taught him that when people are cornered, they reveal instincts you can't always trust. And these two women, fragile as they looked, carried a past he couldn't begin to touch. He didn't want his place turning into a prison, but he wasn't sure it could ever be their refuge either. That night, Ethan said nothing. He only stepped onto the porch, set down a tin plate of leftover beans, and closed the door behind him. The next morning, the plate was empty. No thanks. No sound in the dark. Only a few crumbs left on the edge of the dish. Ethan drank his bitter coffee, eyes drifting toward the barn. They were still there, wrapped in old blankets, unmoving as if the earth itself held them tighter than any rope could. The first 3 days passed in that strange rhythm. Ethan tended his chores, mending fence, feeding stock, stoking the stove, yet he always felt eyes on him from the shadows. Lena, the older sister, watched him with sharp, unflinching eyes. Maris was different. She stayed near the hens, her hands gentle but withdrawn. No words passed between them, only small acts, a row of eggs neatly placed by the well, a patched shirt folded across the porch rail. Inside, Ethan's thoughts tore in two. Part of him wanted to push them back into the desert, let the wilderness take them as it had taken so many others. But another part knew if he forced them away, they'd vanish into dust, and no one would remember they'd ever lived. Still, trust didn't come easy. He'd seen too many smiles hide knives. His cabin had been his last refuge, and he wasn't about to let anyone in lightly. At night, when rain pattered against the roof, Ethan sat by the fire, listening to the faint stir of movement in the barn blankets shifting, straw rustling. Sometimes Maris's cough cut through the silence, keeping him awake. His heart sank each time, but his mind warned him, don't interfere. Don't take on trouble that isn't yours. That caution wasn't just towards them, it was turned inward. Because sometimes, when Ethan saw Lena hauling water, shoulders straight through thin, or when he heard Maris humming low to the hens, something restless stirred inside him, a hunger for trust, for presence, for something more than solitude. But whenever that spark rose, memory shoved it back down. Ambushes, betrayals, men who once smiled to his face before turning their blades behind his back, and his heart slammed shut again. One morning, Ethan set out 3 cups of coffee on the porch instead of 1. Steam curled in the cool dawn. A while later, 2 shadows appeared, moving slow. Lena picked up a cup without a word, passed the other to her sister, and they sat near the fence line, sipping quietly. Ethan stared out over the fields. No one spoke. Yet in that silence lay a fragile boundary, not indifference, but a test, waiting to see if trust could take root. The days that followed held the same uncertainty. Ethan had never told them to stay, never ordered them to leave. Lena and Maris lingered like quiet shadows beside his life, working in small ways, never demanding, never explaining. A strange balance formed three broken pasts sharing one piece of land, walled off by invisible fences yet moving closer with every dawn. And in that hesitation, in that constant caution, something unseen had already begun to take root. Ethan couldn't name it yet. But he knew, deep down, it was something that would change everything. Trust doesn't arrive on the back of grand promises, nor does it knock with bold gestures. It seeps in through small, ordinary acts, quiet as rain soaking into dry earth. And on that hard frontier ranch, Ethan Callahan began to notice changes were happening slow, but steady enough to shift the course of his life. One morning, when Ethan stepped out to gather eggs, he stopped short. On a worn cloth spread near the well, the eggs were already laid out in a neat row. No words, no sign of who had done it, but he knew whose hands had risen earlier than his. Maris, the younger sister who spent hours beside the hens, had moved before him. A bit of weight lifted off his chest. Someone had quietly shared his burden without asking for anything in return. The next day, he found his work shirt torn across the shoulder, stitched up with careful seams. Not a tailor's finish, but solid and deliberate. The shirt hung dry across the porch rail in the morning sun, as if left there with no explanation needed. Ethan stood looking at it for a long while, fingers brushing over the mended line, then folded it and carried it inside without a word. Then there was the fence behind the barn, the section that had been leaning for months. Ethan had meant to fix it, but the work always piled up. One late afternoon, he saw Lena bent over, pulling rope taut, her hands sure as if she'd done such things all her life. He started to step forward, to help, but stopped. He only watched. The last light of the day caught her face, steady and focused, no orders given, no request spoken, just two people carrying responsibility together in silence. Slowly, life found a new rhythm. Ethan still lit the fire, still stood alone on the porch with his morning coffee. Yet he wasn't entirely alone anymore. When he carried out his mug, two more waited with it. When he went to tend the stock, Maris had already been there, leaving stray bits of hay on the path. When he came back, some small corner of the house had been mended by Lena's hand. Nothing was discussed, nothing commanded, but everything fell into place as if it belonged there. Ethan had grown used to silence. It had once been his ally on battlefields, the only shadow that kept him steady through long nights. But the silence rising around his ranch now was different. It wasn't heavy, wasn't crushing. It was a silence you could breathe in, the kind that existed between people who understood one another, without words. One evening, as desert winds pushed dust low across the yard, Ethan sat sharpening his axe behind the house. He heard light steps. Without lifting his head, he knew Maris was near the chicken coop. A moment later, she placed a few eggs on the table beside him. She didn't speak, just gave a slight nod. Ethan looked up and caught the faintest smile, thin but real. For an instant, her eyes held light instead of shadows. Another night, returning from the ridge with firewood, Ethan noticed a faint glow in the kitchen. Lena sat hunched at the table, bent over a scrap of cloth. The soft rhythm of needle through thread filled the room. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping in, setting down the wood. She looked up, their eyes meeting in the lamp's glow. He gave a small nod. She lowered her gaze and went back to her work. Nothing was said, but something unseen tightened between them. Day by day, the old wariness retreated. Memories of betrayal and lies still lived in him, but they no longer ruled the whole of his thoughts. In their place came a feeling Ethan barely recognized: trust. Not complete, not spoken, but sprouting in the small spaces of daily life. No declarations were made, but each quiet act stood as proof that they had begun to lean on one another. A home had begun to form not from stone walls or oaths sworn, but from eggs laid out at dawn, from a mended shirt, from a fence held upright, small fragments, meaningless on their own, but pieced together into something whole. And Ethan Callahan, who once believed his life was nothing but dust and silence, now began to feel a quiet certainty. Perhaps he didn't have to stand against the world alone anymore. On the hard frontier, a fever could be as deadly as a bullet. It crept in quietly, burned through strength, and could steal a life in only a few nights. Ethan Callahan knew this too well. He'd seen soldiers fall not from gunfire, but from infection and sickness that no doctor could reach in time. Those memories rose again when he found Maris, the younger sister, who often whispered to the hens shivering under a horse blanket in the barn, sweat pouring down her pale face. Lena sat close beside her, eyes fixed on her sister's features. No tears, just a tight, silent fear pressing at her mouth. When Ethan stepped into the barn, carrying the faint glow of a lantern, Lena didn't speak. She only looked at him, steady and expectant, as if placing her sister's life directly in his hands. Ethan set the lantern down and knelt. He touched Maris's forehead lightly and felt heat blazing through her skin. Her breathing was shallow, her frail body trembling with each wave of fever. He drew in a slow breath. This wasn't a gunfight, but it was a battle all the same, silent, relentless, and one that demanded patience over force. He returned to the cabin, rummaged through old bottles he had saved from his army days, dried willow bark, a handful of herbs for pain and swelling. He filled a basin with water, grabbed a stack of rags, and carried everything back to the barn. That night, he sat beside the two sisters, changing cool cloths across Maris's forehead, tipping water to her lips when she could swallow. Lena never left her sister's side, but it was Ethan who kept the rhythm, steady as he had done once in makeshift field tents. Outside, light rain tapped against the roof, the wind moaning through the cracks. Inside, 3 lives circled together in silence. In Lena's eyes, Ethan saw a fear he recognized, the same he'd seen in widows, in comrades fading away, in people trying not to break. And he knew if he faltered. Maris would not last the night. Time dragged heavy. Each moment Maris gasped harder for air. Ethan's chest tightened. He wasn't kin, owed them nothing, but the worry had taken hold of him anyway. At times he asked himself why. Why risk his peace, his distance, for a woman he barely knew? But then he looked at Maris's frail face, and at Lena's desperate grip, and he understood some choices don't need reasons. Near midnight, the shivering eased, her breathing steadied, the fire burning less fiercely under her skin. Ethan laid a fresh cloth across her brow, then leaned back against a post, his shoulders stiff and heavy. Lena still hadn't moved, but the tension in her gaze softened, for the first time since they had followed him. Her eyes held something besides suspicion. When dawn broke, the roosters crowed over the barnyard. Maris slept quietly now, her face less pale. Ethan stood, stretching the ache from his back, and looked at Lena. She met his eyes, hers rimmed red from the long night, but gentler now, carrying something new, an unspoken trust. Ethan said nothing. He went outside, dumped the basin, and built a fire in the cabin stove. Soon he returned with a pot of beans, split evenly into 3 portions. This time he didn't leave the plates on the porch. He carried them straight into the barn. Lena took one, gave a small nod. No words, but that nod carried more weight than thanks ever could. Over the next days, Maris grew stronger. Ethan kept mixing tea from willow bark, kept the water fresh, kept watch each night to make sure the fever didn't return. Lena stayed close, but her eyes on him were different now, less sharp, less guarded. acknowledging what he had done without ever speaking it. Ethan realized he had changed too. His worry for Maris wasn't just duty. It was real concern, something he thought had been burned out of him years ago. And strangely, it gave him peace instead of burden, as if caring for someone else had steadied him more than solitude ever had. Each evening, Ethan sat on the porch listening to Maris's even breathing through the barn wall, watching Lena's shadow move in the lamplight. His worry never fully left, but in its place grew something he hadn't felt in years: comfort. The assurance that he wasn't standing against the dark alone. A fever had come and gone, leaving behind more than a body recovering. It had bound 3 lives tighter than before. A bounty hunter, and 2 sisters who should have been lost to dust, were now held together by one long night of worry, care, and the decision not to let each other go. There are towns where a man can feel the weight of other people's eyes sharper than any blade. Red Rock was one of those places. Folks there knew well it wasn't the 6-shooters at your hip that cut deepest, but the stares and the sly remarks, like burrs catching in raw skin. Ethan Callahan had grown used to being watched, but that morning, when he walked into town with Lena and Maris beside him, every look burned hotter than the desert sun. The air was heavy, the dust rising around the mule's hooves. Ethan led the way, jaw set, while Lena kept pace beside him, her shoulders straight, her gaze calm but unyielding. Maris rode on the saddle, shielding her eyes from the glare, her face still drawn from the fever yet brighter than it had been. None of them spoke. The road into Red Rock wasn't long, but each step pressed like lead. Ethan knew this town didn't forget, and it sure as hell wouldn't miss a chance to judge. By the time their boots touched Main Street, the talking had slowed. Beer mugs stopped halfway to mouths. Rocking chairs eased still. People stared. No disguises. No pretense. The looks carried curiosity, disdain, and something meaner underneath. Ethan felt every one of them hit his back like thrown stones, and his temper rose with each step. He didn't change pace. His stride was steady, shoulders tight. They wanted him to flinch, wanted Lena and Maris to hang their heads. But no one faltered. They walked on, silent and straight, inside the general store. The air was thick with the scent of flour dust and rusted nails. Ethan placed a hand flat on the counter, voice low and hard. Need flour, dried beans, salt, boots, size 5 and 6. The store boy blinked at him, eyes darting quickly to the 2 women, then nodded too fast and rushed into the back. While he disappeared, Lena drifted toward the shelves, fingers brushing a heavy roll of wool. This one's thick. Good for winter, she said quietly. Ethan gave her a curt nod. Take it. Maris crouched near a lower shelf, studying a row of glass jars, her eyes lit faintly. We could make jam, she whispered. Ethan, fighting down the heat building in him, exhaled through his nose. Take 2, he said. They paid partly in coins, partly in rabbit pelts. It should have ended there. But as they stepped out the door, a shadow blocked their way. Councilman Hardin, vest pressed and mustache trimmed neat, stood planted in their path. His eyes flicked over Lena and Maris before settling on Ethan, bringing them out, shopping like proper wives. Are you? His tone slid like oil, pitched loud enough for the porch sitters to hear. Ethan's jaw tightened, his grip on the feed sack clenching white. I'm buying supplies, he answered flatly. Same as anyone else. Hardin smirked, lips curling. They're still under your roof, aren't they? People are talking. Certain things aren't meant to be paraded in daylight. Ethan's anger boiled up, but his reply came out cold as steel. He squared himself to the councilman, voice carrying down the street. Listen close. Hardin, they live with me. They work. They're free. No one in this town has the right to judge them or me. The silence that followed was thick. A few men turned away. Others smirked, but no one spoke. Hardin's smirk faltered as he smoothed his mustache, forcing composure. Just make sure you know what you're doing. Callahan, don't let it get out of hand. Ethan didn't answer. His eyes cut sharp. Then he turned on his heel. Lena walked beside him, not behind. Maris sat straight in the saddle, chin lifted. They didn't need words. The act itself spoke loud enough. On the ride out of town, Ethan stayed quiet. The weight in his chest was fire, churning with each memory of their stares, their whispers. He hated the hypocrisy of Red Rock men who never worked a day of honest sweat, who never held dying comrades in their arms, yet felt free to pass judgment. The law they prided themselves on was nothing more than a mask for their greed and lust. As the town's rooftops faded behind them, Ethan finally drew a long, hard breath, loosening his hold on the reins. But he knew well, this wasn't the end. Speaking out in front of them all had set a line in the dirt. A warning. If anyone decided to test it, they'd find out fast that Ethan Callahan wasn't standing alone anymore. In a small frontier cabin, change didn't come with thunder or shouting. It came with the smallest of sounds, the scrape of a knife against a cutting board, the slow stir of a spoon in a pot, the shuffle of chairs drawn closer to a table. Ethan Callahan noticed it one evening, when supper no longer meant eating alone under the sputter of a single lamp. Now, Lena and Maris sat with him, firelight flickering across 3 faces, turning the once hollow kitchen into something warmer. That first night they shared a meal. No one spoke much, only the clink of spoons against tin bowls, the soft pop of wood burning in the stove. Yet the silence carried weight. Each had their own plate. None waited for permission. None were commanded. It was a simple supper, but it marked a line crossed from strangers at the edge of each other's lives to something closer. Something shared. After several evenings like that, the cabin itself seemed to grow used to them. Maris began to smile at times, asking Ethan softly about the hens. Lena gathered the dishes without being asked, leaving him to sit over his coffee. Bit by bit, the distance shrank not by promises spoken aloud, but by the steady rhythm of presence. One night, as the fire in the hearth dwindled low, Lena rose and stepped toward Ethan. He looked up and met her gaze steady, unflinching. There was no haste, no sense of debt between them, only a quiet understanding that closeness, if it came, would be by choice. She knelt beside him, her voice soft but firm. I'm not doing this because I owe you. I'm doing it because I want to. Ethan said nothing. He lifted a hand, touched her cheek lightly, then leaned down and kissed her. The kiss wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate, but it carried the weight of a decision. When it ended, Lena rested her head against his chest, breathing even. Ethan held her gently, arms folded around her. Speaking no words, that night, nothing needed to be explained. The peace of 2 scarred people finding each other in stillness was enough. But intimacy carried truths with it, and a few nights later, another truth surfaced. Ethan was on the porch with his morning coffee when Maris came out. She wasn't smiling, as usual. Her eyes were shadowed, her voice unsteady. I remember what it felt like, being owned, when they brought us in front of you. I thought you'd take us the same way. Use us like property. Ethan set his cup down, fingers tightening on the arm of the chair. He didn't turn away. He looked at her directly. But you didn't, Maris continued, voice almost a whisper. That's why we stayed. Not because we needed shelter, but because, for the first time, someone didn't treat us like something to be possessed. Her words cut deep, not as an accusation, but as a raw truth. Ethan had known it in his bones, but hearing her speak it aloud gave the weight of permanence. He didn't search for comfort to offer. He only gave a slow nod, letting silence hold the meaning. From that moment, the bond shifted again. Between Lena and Ethan, there was closeness born of choice. Between Maris and Ethan, there was trust born of painful honesty. 3 lives, 3 pasts scarred by loss, were beginning to step into a shared space not free of shadows, but lit by the faint edge of something new. That night, Ethan sat longer by the window than usual. Outside, the wind hissed through the dry grass, the sky scattered with stars like fragments of memory. He knew nothing could erase the pain seared into the sisters' past, just as nothing could wash the war from his own. But he also knew this from here on. None of them had to carry it alone. News often comes in the morning, when a man is least prepared to receive it. That day, Ethan Callahan stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee and saw Maris standing in the kitchen doorway. Her face looked calm, but her eyes carried something heavy. Lena was just behind her, silent, steady, like a post meant to brace her sister. "There's something I need to say," Maris began, her voice quiet but firm. Ethan waited. "I'm with child. It happened before we ever met you." The words dropped like a stone into still water. Ethan froze, his hand suspended mid-air. The steam from the cup rose between them, but he no longer felt its heat. Old memories rushed back, soldiers he had watched fade in their cots, widows clutching infants, children born in the midst of ruin. And now, inside his own walls, another story was about to be written. He didn't ask who the father was, didn't press for details. The surprise in him was tangled with confusion. But what he said came out simple, steady. "Then we'd better prepare. For winter. And for the child." Maris blinked, startled by the calmness of his words. Perhaps she had feared anger, or rejection. Instead, he stood solid, a man long accustomed to upheaval. Lena's gaze softened too, as if she had been waiting to hear that exact answer. From that morning on, Ethan worked with a new urgency. He split extra wood, stacked it high against the wall. He patched holes in the barn roof where the wind could creep through. He bought more beans, more salt, and when he rode to Red Rock, he added thick wool bolts to the list. Each act was born from confusion turned into resolve. He didn't know how to be a father, but he knew how to prepare. Winter settled in, sharp and biting, but the cabin stayed lit and warm. Maris moved slower, her steps heavier, yet she still lent her hands when she could. Lena stood close, taking on the sewing, the cooking, while Ethan shouldered the heavier work without a word. 3 people who shared no blood now circled around a life not yet born, bound together by necessity and something beyond it. Some nights, with wind rattling the shutters, Ethan sat by the fire, questions gnawing at him. Could he shoulder this? Would the town use it as one more reason to spit their judgment? But each time he heard Maris breathing softly in the next room, or caught Lena stitching a tiny garment out of scrap cloth, he knew turning away wasn't an option. Then spring came, snow loosening its grip, green breaking through the soil. Before dawn one morning, the cabin filled with cries not of fear or sorrow, but of birth. Ethan stood outside the door, hands clamped on the frame, heart pounding like the old battles. Maris's groans quieted, replaced by the thin, strong cry of a newborn. When Lena stepped out, hair damp, face pale with exhaustion but lit with pride, she said simply, "They're both well. A girl. Strong." Ethan walked in, the weight in his chest easing yet uncertain. Maris lay back against the bedding, a tiny bundle in her arms. Her face was pale, worn, but at peace in a way he had never seen. She lifted her eyes to him, and there was no pleading, there only recognition. "Her name is Clara," she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly, taking a step back, almost afraid to disturb the fragile air. The child wasn't his by blood. yet somehow he belonged to the moment. And in the midst of his confusion, warmth spread deep in his chest. In the weeks that followed, life shifted again. Lena tilled the patch of earth behind the cabin, sowing seeds for a vegetable garden. Maris, still weak but steady, carried Clara in her arms, setting her down in a makeshift wooden cradle when she needed her hands free. Ethan tended the livestock, built a sturdier coop, fenced off part of the yard for safety. Work was divided, rhythm found. A true home had begun to form, not from bloodlines or sworn vows, but from surprise, from moments of confusion that slowly shaped into something permanent, out of the most unlikely pieces. A family had taken root, 3 scarred souls and 1 child, writing a story none of them had ever expected to live. That morning, before the sun had cleared the red ridge, Ethan Callahan sat in the saddle, reins tight in his hand. The air was sharp, his breath showing white. He knew today would not be like other days. He wasn't riding for supplies, or for errands. He was riding into Red Rock to speak words he had carried in silence for too long. On the porch, Lena stood holding Clara, her dark eyes following him. Maris sat near the step, her face still pale from childbirth but her gaze stronger than ever. Neither spoke, but Ethan understood he carried their trust with him. The trail into town was familiar, yet heavier that morning. Dust rose behind his horse, each plume reminding him of the years he had chosen quiet, chosen to disappear. But he was no longer a man alone. He had a home now, lives under his roof, and to protect them, he had to stand. As Red Rock came into view, Ethan slowed his horse, but his eyes stayed hard. Porch sitters murmured. Women peered from windows. They knew who he was, and they knew the talk how he had brought 2 Apache sisters and a child back to his place. Rumors spread faster than desert wind. He didn't stop at the store, didn't touch the saloon. He rode straight to the council hall. The wooden steps creaked beneath his boots. Tying his horse to the post, he saw them Councilman Hardin and 2 landowners lounging with coffee cups in hand. Callahan, Hardin called, smirking. Been a while. What brings you here? Ethan stood square, his broad shoulders cutting against the morning light. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried sharp and steady. I came to tell you something. Lena, Maris, and their child Clara live under my roof. They have my land, my fire, and my protection. Anyone who aims to touch them will have to come through me first. The silence that followed was heavy. Passers-by slowed. A few men leaned forward, listening. Hardin blinked, then forced a chuckle, smoothing his mustache. Now, Callahan. No need to make a speech. Who cares what folks whisper? Ethan's gaze hardened. You care enough to whisper, enough to sneer when we walk through town. So hear me now, this isn't for debate. I'm not asking permission. I'm not seeking approval. This is warning. The words cut through the street like a clean blade. Hardin shifted, color rising in his face. But no answer came. No one else dared speak. Ethan turned, stepped off the porch, mounted his horse. He didn't look back. He had said what needed saying. The road home was long and dusty, wind tearing across the flats. His anger still smoldered, but beneath it, a strange relief took root. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence lift. He was done hiding, done letting others define the terms. He had drawn a line, and it was his to hold. When he reached the ranch, the sight before him stilled him in the saddle. Lena was hanging cloth on the line, her braid catching the wind. Maris sat near the door with Clara against her chest, humming in a tongue Ethan didn't know. Sunlight washed over the cabin, the barn, the fenced yard, every board and nail alive with the simple proof of work and care. Ethan dismounted slowly, his steps deliberate, as if to fix the image deep into his memory. This peace wasn't born of running away. It was born of staying put, of building. of refusing to turn his back. He knew challenges would come. Red Rock tongues wouldn't stop wagging. Winters would still be hard. Clara would grow, and each season would bring new trials. But for the first time in years, Ethan felt hope, and perhaps friends listening to this story. This is where we must pause and recognize Ethan Callahan. He is no polished hero, no wealthy man, no saint. He is a scarred soldier, a quiet rancher, a man who once believed silence was all he had left. But when the choice came, he stood firm. He chose to shield the broken, to protect a child not his by blood, to claim a family the world had tried to deny. Ask yourself, isn't that worth standing behind? Would you want to see Ethan continue this path, facing down judgment, fighting back against the town's sneers, and building something true out of the pieces life left him? If so, let it be known. Share your voice. Show your support. Because the West is a hard land. But when a man like Ethan Callahan dares to say, "This is my family," no one lays a hand on them, then even in hardship, there is room for hope.